Good afternoon, or I guess it's late morning now. I wanted to welcome everyone to our panel on the digital divide and digital opportunity. My name is Jordan Crenshaw. I'm Executive Director of the Chamber's Technology Engagement Center. I actually directly run our broadband policy and our privacy policy as well. But today we have a very important breakout talking about an issue that has been in the news and also been a vital lifeline for the economy since COVID-19 has taken over the headlines, and that's the issue of broadband. As we now work from home, are acting as part-time teachers to children in the home with distance learning or going to the doctor through telehealth. Broadband is increasingly important to the American economy and to keeping our lives about as sane as possible during the COVID-19 crisis. But we have two great guests today who are going to talk about bridging the digital divide and increasing opportunity as in light of everything that we've seen, whether it be COVID-19 or the recent social unrest. And today we're joined by Rick Zimmerman, who's the Vice President of External and State Affairs at NCTA. That's the Cable and Internet Association. He also, prior to his work there, was the director of the Telecommunications Division at the Maryland Public Service Commission. Prior to that, he served at the Florida Public Service Commission. He has his bachelor's degree and a master's from the University of Florida. We're also joined today by Mike Saperstein, who is the Vice President of Law and Policy at the U.S. Telecom Association. Prior to that, he was the Vice President of Federal and Regulatory Affairs at Frontier Communications, and before that served as an attorney advisor at the Federal Communications Commission. He's a graduate of Notre Dame and also the Columbus School of Law at Catholic University. So we are thrilled to have you both today and looking forward to having a good conversation. So what I'm going to do, I think the format of today, what we'd like to do is have our panelists have a few opening welcome remarks. I have a few questions that I'd like to get into with them, and then we'll open things up for questions after that. So Rick, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate you and the Chamber for this opportunity and joining Mike on this panel. Appreciate the opportunity to wear a dress shirt and a blazer for only the second time since March 13th. Looking forward to a good discussion today. So when we talk about broadband networks, I want to separate a little bit the performance of networks for those that subscribe and those that have them available from the questions of how to get broadband to those to whom it's not available or to those to whom it's available but choose not to subscribe. So those are, a different set of issues across the board. But I want to start out with network performance, because what we have seen during the pandemic, which in every way is unprecedented, has been an unprecedented real-time test of broadband networks, one that we never thought we would see, and we hope we never see again. But I think by all accounts, networks have performed incredibly well. On our website, and I would commend folks to visit our COVID-19 page on the NCTA website. We have a network performance dashboard that has shown the increase in both downstream and upstream traffic based on the number of folks staying at home, working from home, and as you mentioned, telehealth, distance education, all of those things and the stresses that it has placed on the network. But as it turns out, because broadband networks are engineered to a particular peak, for the most part, we have not really experienced any issues or problems or even hit that peak. And to the extent in a very, very minimal number of network nodes where capacity was stretched to the limit, companies have gone out and upgraded or done what they need to do to ensure things are working. But overall, broadband networks have performed very, very well. And I think that has been a surprise to some in the punditocracy that we deal with, the tech blogosphere, et cetera, that were only too willing to assume or state at the outset that networks would collapse under the weight of everyone working from home at the same time. And that didn't really come true. We saw a small handful of articles with sort of, you know, badly engineered speed tests and bad speed test platforms making claims that really were not accurate about speeds that people were experiencing. And again, for the most part, for folks that have broadband, and I'm going to reserve our discussion about how to get broadband to those that don't till our Q&A portion. But for those that have it, perform very well. And then I just want to make one other comment, which is wireless and Wi-Fi, because people forget about the fact that, you know, for the average home, there's probably only one wired connection, and maybe you've got one or two devices that are actually physically connected to the network. And every single other device you're using, whether it's, you know, 10, 15, 20 devices, which are not unusual when you count the number of laptops, iPads, tablets, phones that, you know, aren't on cellular while you're at home, gaming devices and consoles, all of those things, that what is super important is Wi-Fi in the home. And of course, we could have a whole webinar about Wi-Fi and spectrum and all of that, and that's not what we're about today. But I just want to remind people of the importance of Wi-Fi and also tuning their home Wi-Fi, because it turns out that sometimes, to the extent that folks may be having some kind of seeming speed or connectivity issue, that they're not maximizing the performance of their in-home network. And so the FCC itself, as well as we and others, have pages, references, documents that you can look at on how to fine-tune your Wi-Fi, your home network, to make sure that you're getting maximum performance. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Jordan.
Thanks, Rick. I also have to keep remembering my Wi-Fi password as well, too. So that's also another thing I need to do as we switch over. Mike, wanted to throw things over to you and open things up from your end.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. And thanks to the Chamber for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here talking about, you know, COVID and how broadband networks have performed and where we can go from here. You know, U.S. Telecom represents the broadband industry, more of the traditional telcos side as opposed to the cable side. But I think between us, we form the vast majority of the wireline broadband industry. And so we too took a look at the different types of demands that we were seeing on our networks. And I remember those early days, there were just nonstop questions from everyone, be it the government, be it from press, from consumers. Can the networks handle this? And in a way, it was the great stress test of our networks. And the answer was resoundingly yes. And we saw things very similar to what Rick described on our networks. I mean, if you imagine that the average consumption and traffic on the networks increase somewhere between 20 to about 30% in those first couple of weeks. I mean, think about your highways at home. What would happen if, you know, they're congested up? What would happen if you put another 30% traffic on there? But we didn't see the types of congestion that I think, to Rick's point, people were really expecting us to see. And the reason for that is that the networks were really designed for demand, and they were designed for peak demand. And what we saw was really an elongated peak. And so, as opposed to, you know, the networks being designed for everyone to be home watching Netflix on Friday nights, all of a sudden we saw that type of traffic just all day long. But the good news is that, well, a couple of interesting things. One, we saw a real peak of traffic just under 30% around April 13th. So I think many of us went home probably around March 13th-ish. At least that was the case in our office, and it seems to be similar for many I've talked to. But we really hit a nationwide peak around April 13th. And since then, traffic has really gone down and remained constant around the 12-13% increase over the baseline pre-COVID that we had seen. But what we had also taken a look at And we also have some stats on our network, our webpage as well. I encourage you to go to ustelecom.org and check this out. Is that we looked at, okay, well, it's one thing that, we're seeing this extra traffic, the networks are handling it, but are we close to kind of maxing out the network here? And we took a look at the different peering links and essentially the headroom and the amount of excess capacity that was still on the networks. And we have been tracking that over time as well. And generally speaking, there remains around somewhere between 50 and 70% excess capacity in the peering links of the network. And that in a large part is due to the design and the pre-thought, pre-COVID, before COVID was anyone thought in anyone's mind, that they wanted to bring the traffic closer to the end user, to get it off the backbone, to do things to really make the experience better for the consumer and reduce the time they had to wait. So there was a lot of pre-planning that went into this. And obviously, I don't think most of it was done with COVID in mind, but they were really designed well and have performed incredibly under the stress. What we have also seen is that broadband has become an essential service for everyone throughout this country. And COVID has certainly laid bare many of the problems that we have with the digital divide in this country. And we can get into this, but there are probably more questions than answers at this point, but this is probably one of the preeminent policy decisions that we have facing us right now. I have a rising first grader, and we're trying to figure out if he's going to be going 2 days a week or completely virtual, but that still leaves 3 days a week where he's going to be working from home. And I know many different school districts around the country are going to be going virtual only. So and we're in a fortunate position that we have an internet connection and we have a device that he's able to connect to complete his learning, but not everyone does. And it's not just education. There's all kinds of different things that I know we'll get into, but I think the core nature of the internet for all of us has really been exposed by this. So I'm very happy the networks have been performing, but there's a lot of work to do to get us up to speed on where we need to be as a country. So.
Thank you, Mike. And I think that actually dovetails into a question I did want to ask. And, the networks have been handling the capacity changes pretty well in the US. You compare that, across the pond to, how Europe is doing. Are there any differences we're seeing there? And are there any policy reasons behind why we're seeing a difference between, say, Europe and the United States in terms of capacity?
So, Rick, I'll jump in there if that's all right with you. There have been numerous studies, and we have had these on our website as well, comparing the US versus Europe and other places around the world. And some of these studies have been from, sources that frankly haven't been overly industry friendly in the past, and have been pretty critical of the performance of broadband networks. But, I was looking at one from a site called Broadband Now that actually found that, the US was the leader of the countries in the top 10 in population with the least decline in the overall performance. In fact, we've have other things. The contractor that does the studies for the FCC's Measuring Broadband America program said that the performance was largely seamless to the end user. So I think, and in analyzing this versus the policy choices in other places around the world, the US, and particularly over the past few years with this light touch regulatory approach, has really incentivized investment. And as opposed to some of the other countries where it's more of a shared infrastructure, and that's how they've gone about deploying broadband across their nations, the US has really promoted competition, and more than promoting competition, it's been infrastructure-based competition. And I think that's one of the things that has really paid off here. And that's what I was getting to earlier with, you saw people automatically designing their networks for better and more capacity just to be a big player in the competitive market. And I think that's one of the things the US really has gotten right over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I think Mike is exactly correct and has hit the nail on the head that it's about incentivizing investment, and that's what the U.S. regulatory policy has done. Every year or every other year, the PPI, the Progressive Policy Institute, puts out an investment heroes report, which looks broadly across industry sectors and investment. And every year, the communications sector is either the leader or, along with the energy sector, number two. But of late, it's been the communications sector that is investing more than any other sector, industry sector in America. And that is a key distinction from Europe, where, as Mike points out, the regulatory policy there, the shared infrastructure, et cetera, does not induce additional investment as it does here. And as my members compete with Mike's members, there's sort of a constant arms race in terms of upgrading networks, expanding capacity, and doing all of those things that have led to the great results that we have had, nationwide for all of our companies.
Yeah, I mean, we've been spending collectively between Rick's members and my members around $80 billion a year for the past several years in order to try to continue to expand our broadband infrastructure. So there's no doubt in my mind this investment's what's paying off.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. And I think you both bring up the light touch regulatory approach, which encourages investment. When we didn't have such a light touch approach, before the last 3 years, we actually saw broadband investment decrease for the only time outside of a recession. So, I think obviously the last couple of years of increased investment have contributed to that quite a bit. I would be derelict in my duties today to not talk about public-private partnerships. That's what the point of the entire conference is about, and building resilience. But what are some of the, either examples or, how can industry and government work better together to make sure that we have all Americans connected?
I'll take a stab at that to start. Just a couple of examples are there's a Massachusetts and also a Virginia broadband grant program. In Massachusetts is the Massachusetts Broadband Initiative, MBI. In Virginia, I went to a conference, it was pronounced three different ways: VATI, VATI, but it's the VATI. And Virginia, I forget what the A is, Telecommunications Infrastructure. But the bottom line is those are grant programs that encourage private providers to work with local entities, institutions, governments, et cetera, to sort of, I'll say, edge out their networks. And they are structured in such a way that it has really encouraged some great results. And these are for sort of small, 100 homes, 200 homes, things like that, where the network economics just really did not permit a private provider to go in on their own and make a go of rolling out a broadband. But by changing the economics, by providing a capital grant for building to those homes with sort of, minimal regulatory overhang other than you do what you say you're going to do, which is build to these homes and provide a particular speed or better. We've seen great success in Western Massachusetts and some various, and I get confused in Virginia between the Northern Neck and the Eastern Shore and all of the little, the piece parts in the Southwest, et cetera. But the bottom line is these sort of infill locations that didn't otherwise have broadband. And so those are two examples that I would point to where the state has really gotten it right.
Yeah, and I guess I'll follow up with two examples, one micro and then one macro. We hear a lot about municipal broadband and towns kind of taking it upon themselves to build out their own infrastructure. And I think we've seen kind of repeatedly that model has not worked successfully. But one of the things that we are starting to see now is more along the public-private partnership lines that Rick was discussing. One of U.S. Telecom's members, Consolidated Communications, partnered with the town of Brooklyn, Maine. And essentially what Brooklyn did is it went in and assessed its needs and said, look, we don't have the connectivity here. We know it's an expensive place to build. This is what we want. And so then they took it upon themselves to partner with an experienced and established broadband provider. And they held a proposal, and it happened that Consolidated was able to come in and meet their needs. But they weren't taking all of the risk upon the citizens of Brooklyn. Instead, they were partnering with a provider that has experience and knows how to go in and quickly deploy fiber throughout the town. So they ended up deploying about 22,000 new feet of fiber as a result of this public-private partnership. And we're seeing more of those things. And that's what I would encourage municipalities that are looking at this to think about. Instead of saying, okay, let me start from scratch and figure out how to build a whole new broadband network, how can we partner with an existing provider out there who has the experience and knows how to do it, but maybe the economics didn't make sense? Let's go into this together. So I think those partnership models make a lot of sense. I guess on the macro part, I would be remiss if we didn't mention that the FCC's got its Rural Digital Opportunity Fund coming up at the end of this year, starting October 22nd, I believe, which is going to put $16 billion out for competitive reverse auction for providers to come in designated areas that are unserved. They don't have any service today at 25.3 and bid to provide those. And essentially, it's whoever can provide the most service at the least price will be the provider supported there in the future. And I think there's a lot of potential for that model moving forward as we start to evaluate. There's always a finite amount of funding, but how do we get the most bang for our buck? And I think the FCC has really hit on something with this reverse auction concept that they'll be going through towards the end of this year. So we're excited about participation in that.
And I think those are all great examples. I think the Virginia example and also the Maine example are ones we should all take to heart, and remembering when we want to look at good ways for government and the private sector to engage. I guess now we're talking a little bit more on the access side. I want to get a little bit into the adoption side later on in the conversation, but when it comes to access and deployment of broadband, what are some of the issues that are inhibiting that from getting out to areas that need it?
One of the biggest factors for our members is the cost of pole attachments. So there is currently a regulatory regime in place for poles that are owned by what are known as investor-owned utilities, but by federal law, poles owned by cooperatives and also municipal governments are not regulated at the federal level. A handful of states do regulate them, and we tend to see in those cases pole attachment rates that are 2 to 3 times higher. We issued a study last July, I guess it was, showing on average 2 to 3 times higher for pole attachment rates. And we have found particularly in rural areas, and hopefully this is not too insidery. I'm not sure who the attendees are today, but of course it requires essentially more poles per person in rural areas because of the lower density, more poles per person on average to reach folks. So the fact that the attachment costs are higher to begin with and that it's more poles to get out there means that as we are trying to deploy to new and rural areas, that sometimes pole attachment costs can be, upwards of 30% of the entire cost of a build. So we are looking to ensure that pole attachment rates are reasonable. And in particular, as electric co-ops get into the broadband business, which is happening in a number of states, that, in exchange for the right to be in the business, if they're going to be competing with us or providing an essential input like a pole to which we're going to attach, that those rates ought to be regulated probably at the FCC rates. Now, there are a number of other factors with poles, make-ready costs and things like that that also are problematic, and I think we are hopeful that the FCC will be taking a look at that soon as well. But But number one on my list, and I will have others, and I'll defer to Mike here in a second. But number one on my list is pole attachments, and in any in a variety of flavors.
Yes, and once you start working on poles, you never stop looking at them, and it's one of those things. But poles are certainly an important part, because at the end of the day, we're stringing wires on poles across vast stretches of the U.S. So I agree with Rick's points there. I'll take it in a slightly different direction. One of the things that we have been working on very hard to try to bridge the access gap is to map where broadband is. That's a good looking pole there. I've got some in my neighborhood.
I'll switch my background there just so you can see. Now, that happened to be in Jamaica. I think, in the U.S., you're less likely to see something so unkempt. But anyways, please continue. I'll go back to my regular background here.
No, so our point is that it is very difficult to know how to serve people if you don't know who is served and who is unserved. So for a couple of years now, U.S. Telecom in particular has been very active on the broadband mapping front. And I think there are a number of known problems about the kind of over-inclusive view that the FCC's current data has about who is served and who is not served. According to their forms, the most granular it gets is the census block level. And so if one home or location is served in the census block, then everything shows is served in the census block. So for example, in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction that is coming up at the end of this year, they're only focusing on completely unserved census blocks. So there's not a soul who is served in there. But we estimate that there's probably another 5 million plus locations that are served throughout rural America, and some of like the suburban areas as well, and even into possibly some of the more urban areas that are shown as served according to the data sets that we have, but truly have no access available to them, and really have no access to the funds because of the limitations of the data sets. So we have been excited. We were excited about the Data Act that passed Congress earlier this year. Unfortunately, while it required the FCC to design and deploy these maps, it has not yet provided funding to do so, although there seems to be some positive steps going forward with appropriations on that front. And the FCC is also going to be taking steps tomorrow at its open meeting as well to add more structure to its own mapping process. But number one, if you're going to serve everybody, you have to know who's served and who's not. So that's step one. And the other two is can we get a real commitment, not just from the FCC's Universal Service Program, which has its inherent limitations, but can we get a real commitment from Congress to step up and fund these areas once and for all? Because if we rely on the FCC's Universal Service Fund, we're going to go through an inherently incremental approach. And while $16 billion is a lot of money, it's not going to get us where we need to be. And so, but without Congress stepping in to provide additional funding and to close the access gap once and for all, I fear it's going to be a game of incrementalism. And part of it is also driven by, what are the standards at which you're building to, and what are you considering already served? And there's a lot of policy choices inherent in all of that. And there are a number of different figures out there floating as to how much it would cost to do this. And that really depends upon some of those dials you would turn as to who is served and who is not. But I think without congressional support to get us there, and I don't know if this doesn't get us there, I don't know what will, because certainly this has shown just how essential broadband is for everyone, but we're really calling on Congress to step up and try to serve these unserved once we can get the maps in place.
And Jordan, I just want to jump in and build on something that Mike said, which, this discussion, the talk about unserved, and make a point as to why it is so important to focus on unserved, because sometimes whether it's in policy discussions, whether it is in Congress, in state programs, elsewhere, there is talk about underserved. And by that, people often mean, well, they have something, maybe it's 25.3, but, we think they should have more because, in technologically advancing society, everyone has to have 100 by 100 or 100 down, 10 up, or whatever it is. But the problem that folks fail to recognize when they focus on underserved versus unserved is that if you keep moving the goalpost that way, then the unserved will never be served for this reason. If we started giving out money, let's say, and the new speed that we're funding is 100 by whatever, the places that already have 25.3, they are inherently less expensive to serve because someone is already there. The network economics are such that you've got facilities, you have infrastructure, et cetera, in place. The places that have no service, the unserved, those are the ones that were too expensive, where the network economics did not permit in the first place. So if we keep putting them at the back of the line, then they'll never be served. And the analogy that that I like to use is, you think of gathering your family and friends and relatives and whomever at Thanksgiving, and everyone gets to go through the buffet line at least once before anyone goes back for seconds. That's what we're talking about here. We need to make sure that those people that have not had their first, bite of turkey and stuffing are going to get something before we go back to those that have already eaten to have a second helping. So we really need to focus on unserved, whatever the definition is going to be, and not this, subjective term of underserved that we sometimes see popping up. Jordan, you're muted.
And this is why we need to make sure we have broadband so we can talk. I like the buffet analogy. I think that's a good one. I hope that's pre-COVID and not during COVID. But anyway, we talked a little bit about the access piece, and I think obviously access is important, but adoption is also important as well too. There are areas where there is access, but there's difficulty in getting connected. For example, looking at things like the homework app, we're seeing that, your 1 in 4 families, children are less likely to be able to access a computer to get to the internet. If their family makes under $30,000 a year, for example, or we're seeing, Latino communities, 18% don't have access to a computer to log on. But then again, also there are issues too, just with affordability during COVID-19 and being able to connect. Can you tell us some of the ways that the broadband providers are working to keep Americans connected, even though we're going through an intense financial strain at home?
Mike, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So, as you may have been aware, the Chairman Pai called on America's broadband providers to join the Keep Americans Connected pledge. And that essentially asked providers not to impose any late fees or disconnections for those who cannot pay their bills during the COVID crisis. And I believe virtually all of our members had signed up for that, and were very proud to stand up and say, this is what's right for our customers. This is what we're going to do because broadband is so important during these times. The official pledge ended on June 30th, but I don't think we've seen any diminution in our carriers' commitment to their customers. We're still seeing and it's taking different flavors now, which is probably the more appropriate way. Some of U.S. Telecom's members are very, very large, and some of them are very, very small, serving very small rural areas. And they're each serving their own customers and working with them on the affordability concerns in different manners. And I know they're all proud to do that, in addition to the things that they went to go above and beyond. I think there are the stories about entities going out there, even in very remote rural areas, and putting Wi-Fi hotspots throughout town, or working with the school districts to get a list of those who weren't didn't have coverage of service available to them, and figuring out how they can go about doing them. I think the list goes on. And what we've seen is an extraordinary commitment from America's broadband providers at a time when I think Americans needed them most. But it's a difficult time for everyone, because to the extent that revenues aren't coming in for the internet service providers, that can only last for so long too, right? Because they need to run the network, they have costs associated with running the business. And so what we're really thinking about now is both a COVID, what we do now, and also a long-term, where do we go from here strategy on making broadband more affordable for those who cannot afford it, both during this time, and then maybe it's some kind of revamping of the lifeline moving forward in order to make broadband more affordable, because we've seen now that it's just an integral part of people's lives.
And so I'll agree with all of that. And our members were certainly part of the pledge as well, and all of them have continued in some form or fashion, and have programs that were adoption related that continue with some tweaks for the pandemic. I'll just mention a couple. Comcast Internet Essentials program, which provides low cost devices and broadband to both seniors, veterans, and low-income households. Charter has a program, Spectrum Internet Assist, that is similar to that. Cox has a program, Connect to Compete, that is more focused on the connectivity, but partners with others for the cost of devices, et cetera. But I did want to leapfrog from your question, Jordan, to make sort of 2 points, one about adoption generally, one about homework gap / distance learning, education, et cetera. And I'll start there. And it is really important, as we're all thinking about going back to school, et cetera. And Mike mentioned he's got a rising first grader, and I've got I guess a 7th, 8th, and 10th grader. I'm in Montgomery County, Maryland. They just announced that we're going to be virtual only for the first month or two before some staggered classroom, et cetera. But as we look at online learning and the successes, failures, whatever it may have been during the pandemic so far and maybe going forward, it's not just about connectivity. There is a whole suite of issues that policymakers need to focus on, including teacher training, including curricula that is fine-tuned or tweaked for online delivery. There have been a number of editorials that I've seen, in particular from Donna Brazil and USA Today and elsewhere, and other educators about what it will take to really be able to provide virtual online classrooms for those that, whether it's for health reasons, that's what we continue with, or sometime in the future. But it's not just about having everyone connected. So while that is an admirable goal, that in and of itself will not fix whatever education problems we have. But then with adoption per se, have to recognize that it's not just about the cost of broadband. We've seen a number of studies, including recent studies, that show that it is lack of a device, as you mentioned, lack of digital literacy, and a stunning number to those of us that live and breathe broadband, and this is what we do every day. A stunning number of people that believe they just don't need broadband access, and therefore they choose not to adopt. So I just want to throw out there that as we consider how to solve the adoption problem, which, by the way, is larger when you look at the numbers than the access problem, to the extent that there is, let's say, 5 or 6% of the country to whom no wired or fixed wireless broadband is available, the number is 20 plus percent of those to whom broadband is available, but choose for any number of reasons not to subscribe. So I just want to be sure in both cases that we're recognizing that it is a multifaceted problem and issue.
So I think we'll go ahead and go. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Mike. I think we'll go ahead and take a few questions from the audience. Actually, first one I saw, I think we actually asked pretty straight up. Here's one. Any thoughts on the possibilities of assessing a short-term tax, individual or business, to pay for digital access?
Let me take a different stab at that question. I don't know about that, but currently the Universal Service Fund, which funds both high cost areas as well as low-income support programs, as well as some telehealth programs, is collected by a fee on everyone's telephone bill. And as an economist by training, there's nearly universal agreement among economists that the right way to collect the funds would be out of general revenue from Congress making some kind of allocation, or policymakers, whoever it is, state, federal, whatever, rather than depressing the service, the take rate for the service that you are trying to enhance. There have been a lot of discussions about changing the contribution mechanism, but whatever it is, it falls short if it's an assessment just on users of the service. So if the question is, should tax revenues be used to support broadband access in some way, or further deployment, or even low-income support programs, then if that is an alternative to the way it's done now, then I think the answer would be yes.
Yeah, we're agreeing a lot today, Rick. So I would answer the question in much the same way. I would just go a little bit further to kind of expand on what the Universal Service Program does now. There's 4 real components to it, and I think they've all become heightened levels of importance during the COVID crisis. There's the High Cost Fund, which is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and some others that I mentioned earlier, and that's to bring access in high cost areas. But there's also a program called E-Rate, which is designed to bring the educational connectivity to schools. There is a program called around telemedicine, and that has certainly was not as the funding for that hadn't been at the same historical levels that the other programs had, but that has taken off. And Congress, as part of the CARES Act, gave the FCC millions more dollars to delegate just to enhance telehealth programs alone. And then there's also the Lifeline program, which is designed to enhance the lower income people's ability to afford broadband service. But that's capped at a $9.95 range. And so that still leaves the broadband affordability out of touch for a certain number of people. And so I think, to Rick's point, the current mechanism we have for funding all of those is through this contributions that everybody's paying on this portion of their bill, and it's just not sustainable. And so I do think it would require Congress to act. And if Congress cares about each of those elements, and I believe they do, I believe they've recognized the importance of education and broadband. I think telehealth, and there's never been a bigger boom in telemedicine than we've seen during the COVID crisis, and really the affordability crunch. And that's putting aside the overall access, high cost issues. I think we're going to have to see a congressional solution come out of the summit.
I think we kind of touched on this a little bit. I know, Rick, you did, in terms of some of the work that your companies are doing. But given the immediate needs of families navigating through COVID, how are broadband companies committing to their communities? I think, outside of the Keep Americans Connected pledge, any other things that broadband companies are doing within the community?
Well, so we have the low-income programs that I mentioned. There are for those in financial distress, there are programs as well with respect to staying connected and paying bills and that sort of thing. I know that a number of our companies are working directly with educational institutions, both to get people connected and also make sure that the institution itself has appropriate connectivity. So I think there's any number of programs along those lines that our companies are engaging in.
Yeah, I would echo that. And certainly, some of our companies, for instance, AT&T has a low-income program available, and Verizon, I know, is offering substantial discounts on their products for those who have had needs because of the COVID crisis. I would really encourage you to go to our Action Center on US Telecom, because we've got a listing of what each of our members is doing there. And I think to my earlier point, since the Keep Americans Connected pledge has officially ended, you've really seen a lot more of a blended response in how people are serving their individual community. So I think going there to check out, who your local providers are and what they're doing in their community would be a big help.
And similarly, we've got a COVID-19 response page at ncta.com. You're back on mute, Jordan.
You're my mute whisperer. Thank you. Any thoughts on incorporating distance learning to individuals like the incarcerated to help them prepare for society, or anything for educating parents as well?
Look, I think we're in favor of any kind of use of broadband possible to enable a betterment of people's lives. And certainly the incarcerated population could have substantial world at their fingertips that they could not previously have through online opportunities. So, I think the sky's the limit there.
Well, seeing as we don't have any other questions from the audience, if I'll give everyone maybe 30 seconds for final words if they have it. But Rick, I'll start with you.
Sure. So there's one policy goal that we have that I didn't mention, which is today for federal broadband funding programs, there is this sort of outdated, anachronistic requirement, which says that we need essentially state permission to receive federal funds to deploy broadband in a particular state. And we think it's time for that requirement, it's known as the ETC, the Eligible Telecommunications Carrier Requirement, to be eliminated. It comes from the 1996 Telecom Act, so it's been around for 24 years or whatever it is. And we don't think it's necessary anymore. And as it turns out, the state programs that I mentioned, Massachusetts, Virginia, almost every state that has its own grant program does not have an analogous ETC requirement. So we think that that federal oversight is more than sufficient, and we commend those members of Congress that have put forth various bills that would, in fact, eliminate that requirement. But otherwise, Jordan and Mike, appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today. I will just mention, and I don't know how familiar people are with the portal that we're using, which was new to me, not the Zoom part, but the Hub part. I did upload 2 documents there that I believe should be accessible to anyone that was registered for the meeting.
And Mike, I'll let you have the last word there.
Well, we're not going to get out of here with a complete kumbaya. So I'll offer a slight twist on what Rick said. The ETC requirement has been around since the 96 Act, and I think US Telecom's members have been legacy, had the ETC requirement. So I don't know that I would agree that it's time for a holistic reassessment of what that means. But I think regulatory parity is an important thing for us moving forward. So all that said, and that's it can be a little bit of an in the weeds issue, but I think the macro point is that, we're really proud of the job that our companies have done standing up and serving Americans. Nobody really knew how this was all going to turn out, but I think a lot of pre-planning and pre-thought made the broadband networks the success they have been. look, we've got a long way to go in getting universal connectivity out there. And there's a lot of important policy debates to have. And we welcome a lot of voices as to how we can go about solving these, because these are going to be, I think, the coming issues of our time is how do we make sure everyone is on board? And, to Rick's earlier point, we also see that not everyone, for whatever reason, believes they need to be. What do we have to do to reach out to those people and make sure that they understand how relevant and how important it can be to their lives? So during COVID, the networks performed well, but that was just job one. And now our next step is to get everybody connected. So we're looking forward to the challenge ahead.
Well, we've got a lot of work cut out for us. I appreciate both of you all sharing your time with us today to talk about how to make sure Americans are connected and adopting broadband. Shameless plug as well for the Chamber's Technology Engagement Center. You can find all of our work on broadband at americaninnovators.com. So we encourage you to visit there as well. But if you all have any questions for the Chamber, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you for your time for joining us, our guests today as well. So thanks again.